With the death of Cliff Burton, Metallica had some serious thoughts to go through and really had to deal with their mourning. As they pushed past this, they were on the hunt for a new bassist, eventually ending the search with Jason Newsted joining the fold. Jason Newsted, the former leader slash bassist of the band Flotsam and Jetsam, whose first album, Doomsday for the Deceiver, was getting some very fine reviews and remarks. The band was an up-and-coming group out of the Southwest. With his departure, the media kind of significantly downplayed their attention toward this band afterward. However, they are still definitely a band worth looking at and worth reckoning with, even to this day. However, what this led to was the eventual fourth studio album by Metallica, entitled And Justice for All. And Justice for All was very, very different than Master of Puppets and anything that came before it. In fact, it was leaps and bounds different. This is an album that almost borders on progressive metal in a way, just the way in which a lot of the songs are constructed. That's at least the way that a lot of people looked at it whenever it was initially released in the late 1980s. Now, of course, with bands such as Dream Theater and others that have followed, it's very difficult to really perhaps place it under that same umbrella these days. However, back then you can kind of understand exactly what they were coming from. This was something that took a lot of people by surprise, and not to mention was something that a lot of metal fans maybe hadn't heard that much, especially out of a thrash album. Flemming Rasmussen once again returned to be the producer of this album, but was notably absent during a lot of the sessions. There are many people that claim, including Rasmussen himself, that claim that this is the reason why the production of the album seems so stale and so, the way that it is. The production is actually very tinny. It's something that definitely has a different resonance than the previous albums under his wing, such as Master of Puppets, which seems extremely polished, has just fantastic leveling and everything like that. Everything seems in its place, whereas with this album, there is just that notable clang noise, not to mention the bass is kind of inconsistent on this record, and that's not to the fault of newcomer Jason Newsted. It's actually partially the production errors. There are some areas on this record where Jason Newsted's bass is very prevalent. You can definitely tell exactly where it is, and you can hear it very clearly. Whereas on other portions of this record, it seems almost completely gone. It almost seems as though his bass is not present whatsoever. Song structures on this record are definitely unconventional. It's definitely an album where they've stuffed just tons and tons of riffs into these tracks, and they have definitely been able to string them together. Some of these riffs easily could have been their own musical idea. They could have easily transformed into another song. It's kind of interesting to think in your mind if Metallica was writing the way that they were, say, in the Master of Puppets / Ride the Lightning era, or even the Kill 'Em All era, with some of the riffs that they have had just on portions of tracks on Justice for All, they would have had enough probably to supply about 3 or 4 albums, which would have been just absolutely ridiculous. But we're all thankful here in the metal world that they were able to pack this many riffs into each particular song, because this album is damn good. This is actually kind of an underrated gem to a lot of people these days. Maybe it's because they don't play a number of these songs live. They of course play the single one, and sometimes you'll hear Blackened or Harvester of Sorrow, which seems like a strange choice, but it was the opening single off of this album. But there are a lot of songs on this album that have either never been played live or are seldomly played live, such as Injustice for All, the title track, and The Frayed Ends of Sanity, which is a shame because The Frayed Ends of Sanity, you would believe, would be the perfect song to play live, considering it's just absolutely crazy. One of the main reasons for this is because even the band themselves admitted that some of the songs on this album are just too fucking long, and they encountered this problem a lot after this album was released, while they were on the Injustice for All tour. But let's talk about the music on this album. Let's talk about songs such as Blackened, such as The Shortest Straw, such as The Frayed Ends of Sanity, such as the title track. This is one of those albums where Metallica was, well, actually a little bit politically, socially, ecologically relevant, considering this was a song that really showcased a lot of opinion on that. Lyrics were definitely centered around many issues that were going on at the time, and you could tell just from the cover of this album, the blindfolded Scales of Justice, Lady Liberty, really showcasing that, well, there was definitely a lot of problems going on, and that this album was definitely going to expose a lot of those and be very, very, politically, socially, or ecologically charged. It was going to bring forth many of the issues of the day in a progressive thrash metal album, so to speak. The title track soars at almost 10 minutes in length. It's actually the second longest song on the album, only by 2 seconds, to the instrumental To Live Is To Die. And Justice for All is just a thunderous and huge song. It's very expansive. And because of this, it sometimes may seem downright unlistenable to a novice metal fan or a novice Metallica fan who perhaps started with albums that were after this one. Though, if you start with albums after this one, you might be very, very used to the length by now. At least you should be, especially if you went through the load and reload cycle. However, with that said, this is still quite the song. It's one that I still hear on the radio to this day every so often, which is odd since they barely play it live, but what they do is they play an edited version of the song on the radio. It's probably a little bit closer to 5 or maybe even 6 minutes, but this is just a brimming song. It has a great introduction, just a very, very, soft melodic opening to it as far as the riffing is concerned. It kind of takes you off guard whenever this song really starts to thrash out, but the whole entire structure, and once you get into the main chorus structure, just really has a lot of power behind it, has a lot of gumption behind it, and it really gets you deeply involved. The same thing happens with Blackened. Actually, the same thing truthfully happens with a lot of the songs on this record. The gumption and everything just seems to escalate higher and higher and higher as you continue to listen forward on this album until you finally hit that crescendo, that peak point. And whenever that happens, you are just going nuts. Now, of course, everybody is very familiar with the song One, especially if you're a Metallica fan. This is actually the third single that was released for this record, and it eventually became the most successful single for this album. Not to mention it propelled them to real rock stardom, if you really want to say that. This is something that prior to this album even being released, whenever they were switching record labels, there was kind of a bidding war going on for them, and the bid eventually led to a signage of what would be these days about €1 million. So you can get out your conversion calculators and tell how much that would be here in, U.S. American dollars. Big money, baby. But with One, this is something that also gave them the record sale moxie to go along with it. This was an album that went platinum very quickly, only after about 9 weeks of being released. And that's something that for a metal album, even though metal was really, big at this part of the 1980s, this was unheard of. This was crazy. This is something, though, that happened with Metallica with And Justice for All. Surprisingly enough, it was And Justice for All, and it wasn't Master of Puppets. This is kind of the outbreak that occurred directly after the death of Cliff Burton, almost as though he was looking down on his bandmates and basically sent them heavenly record sales or heavenly help in order to help them become and would become the biggest band in the world. Speaking of Cliff, we hear Cliff one final time. We hear his bass on To Live Is To Die, a song that was essentially crafted around some old bass riffs of his. And we hear his voice. There are 4 lines that are spoken at the end of the song, which for some may argue as not, or makes it not really a true instrumental. However, I would have to definitely argue with them to the core on that one. These are just spoken word, freeform poetry, if you want to call it. Well, in reality, it's not. The first 2 lines are actually attributed and have been written by a German poet. Go ahead and look inside your liner notes. You're not going to see his name. This is something where you have to do a little bit of digging in order to find it. However, the last 2 lines are the words of Cliff Burton. And that is sadly the final farewell that we get from our departed friend. Excuse me. Musically, however, Jason Newsted really is no slouch on this record. Jason shows just why he was chosen for the job. There were so many other people that they could have chosen, and they'd chosen Jason Newsted, who was a relative, up-and-comer. They had a gentleman by the name of Pepper Keenan that was in and sampling for the position. They even had Les Claypool, and we all know that those two are both Two very powerful names that really captured a lot of attention. And we actually saw Pepper once again whenever they lost Jason after, or before Saint Anger, should I say. And it's just kind of crazy. But Jason does a fantastic job on this album. Lars' drumming is just thunderous. James and Kurt are both dueling in some of these portions, and the guitar tone on this definitely is dark. It's dark and dark and dark. And what was strange about it is that even though the riffing was dark, the subject matter was not. Fond appreciation for that. I would say that after coming out of a tragedy such as the magnitude in which they had suffered, by choosing Jason Newsted, they set themselves up best to really succeed in the long run. He had a great dynamic bass structure. He has a tremendous, tremendous palette. Not to mention all the skill and talent in the world. Combine that with the three-headed monster that was still left of Metallica, they were able to do some major things, and they did. And Justice for All is still one of the best-selling albums of their catalog. Not the best, obviously, but still one of them. And because of that, this is an album that, strangely enough, in spite of that, is, I think, a little underrated. I think some people take this album for granted. But this is definitely one of the big four Metallica albums. And it's definitely one of the better Metallica albums. I might not put it number one. I may not even put it number 2 or 3. But it's up there. Upper tier. Revisit this album. You'll know what I mean. Revisit one. Revisit The Shortest Straw. Listen to the epic and Justice for All once again. Listen to Live Is to Die and pay tribute to Cliff. You'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, it's a lot different than Master of Puppets and Ride the Lightning. Yeah, it's got a different feeling than both of those albums. Hell, it even sounds different. Everything about this album sounds different than the last two. But that doesn't mean it's not a damn good album. Because it is.